Before I start the review of this sword here, a short disclaimer. I bought it using my own money and no one's paying me to do this review. I'm just hoping someone would. About my background. So I'm actually a HEMA instructor. More specifically, I train and teach German longsword. I also take part in competitions, both in sparring and in cutting. I also have a general interest in antique longswords and sword typology. So all in all, I have quite a good idea about how these were used in history and how they are used today. Let's start the review with a quick overview. Before that, an apology in advance. I'm probably going to butcher every single Italian word I'm going to say in this review, so sorry about that. This is the Albion Brescia Spadona. It is part of Albion's museum line, which means it's a reproduction of an original antique piece which can be found in a museum somewhere. In this case, the original sword is in the Luigi Marzoli Museum in Brescia, Italy. The original sword is quite often called La Lupa or the She-Wolf because of a wolf inlay on the blade. Now this Albion reproduction is not an exact replica, it is missing the wolf inlay on the blade. The original sword can be dated somewhere mid-1400s. It is quite likely that the blade was produced in Passau, Germany. It's possible that the hilt furniture was produced in Italy. As said, this sword is not an exact replica of the original one. On its webpage, Albion says that their aim was to present the sword as it was when it left the Italian cutler's shop some 550 years ago. Now for some specs of this sword. Basically, the price, the length, the weight, and so on. Let's start with the price of this sword. The sword costs $2,167. In euros, that's something like 1,840 euros. Now, I live in Finland, and Albion is based in the US. So I had to pay $375 for the shipping. In euros, that's something like 320 euros. I have no idea what the shipping costs would be if I'd lived in the United States. Also take into consideration that as I live in Europe and the sword is shipped from States, I also had to pay for import tax, and that happens to be 24% in Finland. That makes this quite an expensive sword. Now for the more detailed specs. Let's start with the total length. I measured this from the pin block to the point of the sword. My measurement was 116 centimeters. Now, Albion's webpage promises 118 centimeters. My sword is 2 centimeters shorter than what they promise. That is a 1.7% difference. Generally, I wouldn't mind 1.7% difference, but this is a really expensive sword. This is also supposed to be a replica of an antique sword, so I would really like to have all the tolerances within 1%. At this point, I'm just going to say I'm still okay with a difference of under 2%, even with this sword. But I would really like it to be under 1%. As said, really expensive, so I also want to have a bit more quality for my money. Now the grip. This measurement is from the pin block to the grip. My measurement, 26 centimeters. Albion's website doesn't have one, so there you go. The second grip measurement is from the end of the pommel to the cross, so only the, grip part of the grip, or grip part of the handle. My measurement is 20 centimeters. Again, the Albion website doesn't have a measurement. Then the cross. As you can see, this sword happens to have quite a wide cross. So I measured from point of the quillon to the other end of the quillon. My measurement is 28 centimeters, so that is definitely a wide crossguard. Now, the blade length. I measured mine from the middle of the blade, so where the floor is, from where the crossguard ends, all the way to the point. My measurement was 88 centimeters. Albion's website, however, cites 89.5 centimeters. That's a 1.5 centimeter difference, which means 1.7%. Again, I would like to see that being under 1% in this price category, but under 2%, so I'm not exactly mad about that. Next, the blade width. I took my measurement as close to the crossguard as I could. Now, I have to say, I used a tape measure instead of calipers. My measurement was 5.8 centimeters. Albion site again says 5.72 centimeters, a 1.4% difference, still under 2%. Lastly, the weight. So I have to say I used my cheapo kitchen scale to get the weight, but it should still be quite accurate. My measurement was 1,570 grams, or 1.57 kilograms. Albion site says 1,470 grams, or 1.47 kilograms. That's a 6.4% difference, and I think that is no longer acceptable, especially at this price point. I would expect better even from a cheaper sword. And especially as this is supposed to be a historical reproduction of an original sword. So I'd really want to have it under 2%, and I think it should be under 1% if possible. This is really not okay, Albion. You should really do a better job. Or if you are actually aiming for a heavier sword, as the difference was exactly 100 grams, you should really update your webpage. Though they updated their webpage but didn't touch the numbers, so I think this is just a tolerance of the production line. Not good. Let's start a closer look at the pin and the pin block. Now before that, all of the hilt furniture, so the pin block, the pommel and the crossguard, are made out of mild steel. Now the pin itself. It's really well made. You can't really see the edges of the pin, you can't feel any ledges, there's nothing that might catch your thumb or your clothes. All in all, extremely well made. It's basically the Albion quality everyone's familiar with. Then the pin block. Again, it's made of mild steel and it's quite simple. It has 8 facets with a dark line going through each of them. It starts wider at the bottom and then it narrows towards the pin itself. Quite simple, some small details I quite like, and it's again made extremely well. Next, the pommel. It is a variation on the Type T, so it is a faceted centstop pommel. This one is a bit special, as all the top facets here are hollow crowned. This means that every intersection of 4 facets is basically a point. I'll touch more on this when I'm talking about the handling and usability of the sword, but at this point, let's just say that those points are quite sharp. Again, the pommel is really well made. All the lines are really sharp, it's symmetrical and it looks really nice. There are no random scratches or marks on the pommel, so again, extremely well made. The grip is wood, which is then bound in cord and covered in leather. This one is dyed black, just like the original one. The easy to see feature in this grip is that it has a razor in the middle. It has these diagonal lines going all around the razor. It looks nice, it's very well made again, and it gives really good purchase for your front hand. I'll be talking more about that in the usability section. Just like most of Albion's swords, the grip of this one has a really nice texture on it. It is made so that the leather is glued on, and before it dries, a cord is bound over it. Then the leather is left to dry. After the leather has dried, the cord is then removed, and it leaves a really nice texture on the grip. Just like on other Albion swords I've handled, the texture is really regular, it feels nice in the hand, in all, it is really well made. What comes for the seam of the leather? You can find it if you really try, but it's really hard to see and most definitely you can't feel it. Again, top quality work. At the both ends of the grip, the transitions are very well made. Once again, there are no ledges and there are definitely no loose leather. Of course, you can feel the folded leather with your finger, but there's nothing that you could actually catch on. Now, future Eetu here, so I just remembered I forgot to mention something. So, let's take another look at the grip. The thing I forgot to mention was the shape of the grip, so here is a quick insert for that. Starting from the cross towards the pommel, the grip starts rather narrow but wide. It's an oval shape, so it is really good for indexing the blade. Towards the center of the grip, so basically the razor, it starts to thicken up. And at the razor it's almost round. Not quite, but almost. So it's just a little bit thinner than it's wide. From the center towards the pommel, it then starts to both narrow and slim down. Just near the pommel, it's basically just round. Now, what does this mean? The front part of the grip gives you the ability to index the blade very well. The thick part at the middle gives you a really good grip on the sword. Especially with the razor, your front hand is not going to slip anywhere. And towards the round later part, it again gives you a really good grip without that much of an ability to actually index the blade, but that's what your front hand is for. Because of the really narrow and round end part, it transitions to the pommel very nicely. So this allows you to actually have your hand partly up the pommel if you want to. Basically like this. All in all, the grip shape is quite unusual. It's more complex than swords usually have, but it is a very comfortable grip and it allows you to index the blade, which is extremely important, and it also allows for a very secure grip. All in all, this is one of the best grips I've ever had on a sword. The Type 8 crossguard is made out of mild steel, and as you can see, it is a quite wide example of that. Just like any wide crossguard should, it is quite thin near the tips of the crossguard. If a wide crossguard is too thick towards the ends, firstly, there is just generally too much mass in the crossguard itself. Secondly, you can easily feel that mass when you are turning the sword in your hand. That is because there's too much mass away from the rotational center of the sword. Once again, the finish on the crossguard is very well made. The crossguard has 6 facets and those are all straight and symmetrical. All the lines are crisp but not sharp. The finish on the crossguard is once again satin, just like this on the pommel. There are no scratches or any other marks in the crossguard. At least there weren't. You can see in the close-ups some scratches here and there, but those didn't come from the factory. Those are caused by my handling. The transition between the blade and the crossguard is exceptionally well made. I have to say that it's probably the best I've ever seen. There's hardly any gap at any side of the blade. Let's move to the blade. First off, in the Oakshott typology, it could be categorized as an 16A or an 18A. It has the characteristics of both. If I'd have to choose, I'd call it an 16A, and that is usually what you see online when people are talking about this blade. The Oakshott typology is a modern invention meant to categorize antique blades, so it is quite natural that antiques were not made to conform to that typology. Because of that, rather a large number of blades are actually hybrids of different types, and so is this. From a production point of view, the blade is very well made. It is symmetrical. Both the fullers and the spine are on the middle of the blade. The fullers terminate on the same spot on both sides. The blade is straight, it's not bent, and it's not twisted in any way. The finish quality is once again extremely good. The blade has the normal Albion satin finish, which is made extremely well. It's even, and there were no scratches or dents when I got the blade. Again, if you see any on the close-ups, those were sadly caused by me. Then the cross-section. For the first third of the blade, basically the length of the fuller, the blade is of a hexagonal cross-section. After the fuller terminates, the blade then transitions to a flattened diamond section for the rest of the blade. Now what is special about this blade is the secondary bevel. It goes through the full length of the blade. It starts something like a centimeter or 1.5 centimeters, and then it narrows down to maybe half a centimeter closer to the point. Now, I'm not talking about a really harsh secondary bevel, the kinds of which you can see on poorly made swords. The change in edge angle is rather small from before the edge bevel to the edge bevel. The wide gradual edge bevel is rather important for the cutting capacity of this sword. Now, even though this blade has a secondary bevel, it doesn't work like on a Japanese sword. It doesn't just transition to the edge. There is still a 1mm or so of an edge sharpening on this sword, and that's how it came from the factory. The sword came from factory what I like to call Albion Sharp. So it's sharp, it cuts paper, it would probably cut water bottles and such, and with this type of blade it would probably cut tatami as well. However, I like my blades as shaving sharp, so I touched up the blade myself. I had no need to actually reprofile the edge as the edge is already good. It's just not fine enough for me. The blade also has distal taper and profile taper, as any good blade should. The blade starts quite wide and stays so through some 2/3 of the blade or so. Then it quite quickly tapers to a point. This gives the blade a really good wide cutting portion. The blade also has quite a lot of distal taper. It's not a thick blade to start with, but whatever thickness it has, it maintains until the end of the fuller. It then thins down. This makes the cutting portion of the blade both wide and thin. This makes it a very good cutter. Very near the tip, it again gains some thickness, ending up with a reinforced point, very good for thrusting. This style of blade makes a very good blade for both cutting and thrusting. As explained, the cutting portion of the blade is both thin and wide. With the cross section of this blade having the fuller and the diamond section with a spine, it also makes the blade rather stiff. Of course, there is some flex, but there is not much. And as you could see, the flex is mostly at the end portion of the blade. As I already said, the blade also has a reinforced tip, and as the blade narrows down very aggressively for the last maybe fifth of the blade, it is really good thruster. A rigid, narrow and reinforced blade is probably good enough to go through mail and gambeson alike. Now let's talk about the usability and handling of the sword. I've basically split this part to 3 different sections. The first section is the basic handling and usability. How is it to hold? How does it feel in hand? Are there any parts which hurt you and things like that? The second part is from the point of view of a training tool. How good of a training tool is this for cutting practice? And the third part is the cutting performance. How well does this cut different cutting media, such as tatami? When you first pick up this sword, it feels heavy. It feels hefty. It has presence, and I don't mean it has lots of blade presence or anything. It just feels substantial. What I mean about this in more generic terms is that when you pick it up, especially in one hand, you can feel the weight around your hand. So it doesn't feel like it's blade heavy or pommel heavy, it just feels heavy. The blade itself is not exactly heavy, it's 1.5 kilos give or take, depending on what specific sword you happen to get. Mine is a close to 1.6 kilos. The one advertised on Albion side is close to 1.5, but not a heavy blade. But it still feels quite heavy. This has everything to do with the balancing of the sword. As soon as you take it in 2 hands, it no longer feels heavy. Now it feels just like a weapon. It doesn't feel like a toy. But it's no longer heavy. This is a sword specifically made to be used in 2 hands. There's a clear difference between having a heavy feeling blade and having a blade which has a presence. I'd say this feels heavy in 1 hand and it feels like it has presence in 2 hands. Now let's talk more about the one-handed experience. As I quickly mentioned when talking about the grip, the razor here gives you really good purchase when you are actually holding the sword in 1 hand. So if you grip the sword so, that the pinky of your main hand is in front of the razor, it is going to give you a really good grip. Your hand is not going to slip from there, and you can comfortably hold this sword in one hand. Again, as said, it feels heavy in one hand and it's clearly not meant to be used in one hand, at least most of the time, but you can definitely use it, especially with this feature here. If you have to use it in one hand, whether it be in horseback or in grappling situations, it's going to work. But if you want a long sword which you mainly use in one hand and then occasionally might be using in two, I'd consider some other sword. Now, the two-handed experience. As said, this is clearly designed as a two-handed sword first, which can then be used in one hand if needed. In my opinion, this sword has the perfect or very close to perfect balance between maneuverability and blade presence. There's enough blade presence that it will cut well and you can feel the blade. You don't feel like you have to force it, but the blade is not also heavy enough to actually make it difficult to do transitions or things like that. This is not the most maneuverable sword in the world. I have definitely handled more maneuverable swords, something like a Type 18B Munich. This is still maneuverable enough that it doesn't feel cumbersome. It's easy to parry, it's easy to keep the point in line, it's easy to move the point around if you need to. You can use it as a thrusting sword and you can use it as a cutting sword. But it still has the blade presence for a cutting performance. It doesn't have such a blade presence as an, let's say, Alexandria from Albion. That is probably the best known cutting sword around. It still has enough blade presence that you don't feel like you have to force it in the cut. In my opinion, this is the optimal combination, or at least the closest I've ever seen, of blade presence for cutting capacity and maneuverability or quickness or nimbleness for all the other actions, be it thrusting or defending or doing transition or anything like this. From all the swords I've handled, this one is the one I would take the way life or death situation if I'd really have to. And it doesn't matter if it would be Bloschfechten or basically just in your everyday clothes, or Harnischfechten, basically armored. This would be my choice of a weapon. It can thrust if there's armor, it can cut if there is not, it's maneuverable enough, it's a really good balancing act of a sword. So that's about the handling. Now about the usability. As I mentioned in the closure look of the pommel, these points here are quite sharp. So if you like to hold the pommel, bad news for you, I wouldn't recommend it. Now I think that if you were to wear a leather glove or something like this, you could probably hold the pommel just fine. Now that's holding the pommel, but what about when you're not? If you are doing transition, let's say from an ascending cut to a descending cut, if you hold the sword as I think you should hold the sword, there's no problem. If you let your grip and your structure to collapse, there is a chance that these points here are going to scrape your forearms. And that has happened to me. Especially when you get tired, there is a bit of a chance that you are going to possibly injure yourself. This is not good. As I said, this is not good. But the thing is, this is a historical design. This is based on an antique sword, so clearly they thought this was not an issue. So what's the thing? I've noticed that if you are wearing anything else than basically a t-shirt or a long-sleeved technical shirt, this is no longer a problem. If I have a hoodie, for example, it's not going to scratch my arms, whatever. So long sleeves, going to fix this. However, be aware that these points here may scratch you, and especially if you like to hold the pommel, that is going to be a problem. A thing I've seen online is that some people have gone and filed these points off. Not even a much less than a millimeter. They've basically rounded them off enough that if they happen to come in contact with your forearms, they are no longer going to scratch you. If you really want this sword and you are a bit worried about the chance that it's going to scratch you, here's an option for you. Of course, I would never do this myself. I really don't want to file anything away from a $2,000 sword. Well, anything else than sharpening the edge, of course, but there's an option for you if you're interested in it. Other than the pommel, there's nothing on this sword that's going to really hurt you. The crossguard around the grip here, it's smooth, it's rounded and so on, so if you like to use a thumb grip, like in the German system, you are not going to get your thumb hurt. The ends of these quillons are quite pointy. If you go and stab yourself in the eye with the point of these, of course, it's not a good thing. They are not like super safe and thick, rounded crossguard ends like you might see on a, let's say, a feather, but they are not inherently dangerous. One thing I actually had to get used to is that the crossguard is quite wide, and before I got used to it, I actually hit myself in the head a couple of times with it. Be aware of that. Again, it was just a learning period thing. It took me maybe 2 or 3 hours of usage from this sword to actually get used to a wider crossguard, but after that, I've really not had any issues with that. And even then, as I said, I hit myself to the head with the crossguard once or twice, but the thing is, the ends of the crossguards are turned up or down, depends on which way you are looking it, but they are turned. So you are not actually going to stab yourself to the head with the point, you are actually going to stab yourself with the turned corner of this. Now, let's take a look at this sword as a training tool for cutting practice. What I mean with this is basically cutting practice is mostly just you cutting air, not tatami or water bottles or anything like that. You are just doing training drills to air and listening for the sword wind, all the swooshing sound the sword makes. When it comes to that, there are a few things which are important. The one is that does it make a clearly audible sword wind? That's the most important part. Rest of that comes to how good of a representation of a sword this is. How does it handle? Is it actually even remotely historically accurate and so on? Let's take a look at those first. Well, is this historically accurate? Well, clearly it is, as it is a reproduction of an antique sword. If you are using this sword as a training tool, you are, well, not as close to a real antique sword as you can get without, well, getting an antique sword. Because, as I said, there are issues with the measurements of this sword to those shown on the Albion side, and I don't know how close those are to the original ones, but this is a really good representation of a historical sword. Then the second thing is that how cutting focused sword this is. If you have extremely thrusting focused swords, the feeling is going to be widely different from a cutting sword or combination sword like this. So for that, I'd say this is a good choice for that. This is a good cutting sword, this is a good thrusting sword, but this is not something extremely thrusting centric. This has enough blade presence to give a good representation of a cutter. So this is good for cutting practice. Now, how good of a sword wind does this have? The short answer is good enough. But let's take a closer look. So, I've handled a bunch of Albions and a bunch of swords from other manufacturers, and the sword wind this makes is from the better end of the spectrum. As said, it's good enough, but it's far from the best. The best ones I can think of are Albion Earl and Albion Ringek. From those two, I'd choose Earl for a cutting training sword, and that is probably the sword I've used most, just because it's a more cutting-centric sword. On the other hand, Ringek is more of a thrusting sword, but it is still a relatively good sword for training cutting. Now, as I said, this has a good enough sword wind to be a training sword, but it's not a good sword wind. So if you are purchasing a sword for training purposes, I would recommend looking for something else. Now for the third part of this section, how good of a cutting sword this is. And this is specifically when cutting media, such as tatami. Now I have to say that I have basically zero experience with other cutting media, such as water bottles and pool noodles, so everything I'm going to say right now is based on my experience in cutting tatami. This is a very, very good cutting sword. It's so good that I would say using this is cheating. Now, it's not as good of a cutting sword as something like Albion Alexandria or Albion Principe at that, but it's still so good that it's going to hide some of your mistakes. From the point of view of using this as a training tool when cutting tatami, so you are trying to analyze your cutting, this is too good. If you want a good training sword and want to cut tatami in a training purpose, you should get something which is not as good of a cutter as this. The same goes of course for something like Albion Alexandria. That is a very bad sword for training, but it is a very good for cutting. So if you are going to a competition, this is an okay choice. But if you really want to maximize your chances, I'd say, at least from Albion, go with an Alexandria or Principe. I've also heard that the Angus trim swords are extremely good, but I have no personal experience with those, so I can't comment. I can just say that this is not the best performing cutting sword I've used. So even though I say that from a training perspective, when cutting tatami and stuff like that, this is not really a good sword for that, and this is not the best sword for competitions, this is still a good middle ground. I don't like to use Albion when cutting normally. I use it when I try to get something really difficult done, because it allows me to do that. It's going to fix enough of my issues just by being an absolute beast of a cutter. I use this for my general cutting when I'm not trying to get all out of my training, but I don't also want to hide all of my mistakes. If I'm only focusing on training, I'm going to choose something which is a bit hard to cut. At the moment that sword happens to be a friend's Albion Earl, because I have access to that, and I think it's a sweet point for being good enough cutter and not being a too good of a cutter when it comes to training. This is somewhere about that. Then really shortly about the purchase experience and the customer support. Let's start with Albion's webpage. Albion is an American company and they clearly haven't still figured out online shopping, which is very weird from my European standpoint. They don't have a cart, and they updated their webpage and they still don't have one. So what's going on, Albion? Get to the, I don't know, the previous century or something. Both times I've ordered my swords using email, and from an European standpoint, sending credit card information over email is sketchy at the least. So, your options are using the weird online form, which doesn't, to my understanding, have online payment, sending your credit card information over an email, which is like extremely American thing. But they don't have online payment options. It's 2021, like what is going on? Get online payment options. It's not so difficult, just buy it from a company. It should be like the standard these days. There's absolutely no excuses to fix this. This is basic stuff. It should not be possible at this time and age to have only send us your credit card information using sketchy options. This is just not okay anymore. So, no. Fix this. Now that that rant is over, I have to say, even though the purchase experience was a bit sketchy, it was still really easy. One thing Albion does very well is payment plans. You can basically negotiate any kind of a payment plan you want as long as the sword gets paid before it is sent to you. In my case, I asked if it would be possible to split the payment in 3 equal parts starting at a specific date. They just answered, of course. And I think that is how it should work. So, even though they don't have online payment, what they have is a really good payment plan support. So, props for that. Albion answers their emails really quickly. So, that is very well handled. I have to say, really good customer support. At this point, most people already know that Albion has long queues. Their normal queue at this point is 9 to 11 months. The queue time they promised to me was that 9 to 11 months. They shipped the sword to me just shy of 12 months. But within that 12 months, the Albion shop was closed for a month because of COVID restrictions. So, they had 11 months of effective work time within that 12 months. They promised to me 9 to 11 months, and they did it in 11 months of work time. they couldn't really have guessed that the shop is going to be closed because of a pandemic for a month, so I really don't hold that to them. Then the shipping. In my experience, Albion shipping, at least to Europe, is very expensive, but they ship their swords very well packaged. Normal Albion swords, basically the next generation line, comes packaged in a sturdy cardboard box, and the sword is held in place so that it doesn't touch the ends of the box in any way. So there's basically zero chance of the blade going through the end of the box. This is really good. Now, this specific sword, and I presume from what I've seen online, the other museum line swords also have a wooden box inside. It's a really rough wooden box, but it is sturdy enough that you'd basically have to drive over the package with a truck or something to cause any damage to the sword. It's pretty sure that the sword is going to come to you in one piece. There's also basically zero chance that the blade is going to go through both the wooden box and the cardboard box. So from a packaging point of view, I'd say this is the best shipping quality I've seen from a sword manufacturer. Finally, the conclusions. Now, this is going to be a bit difficult and require some explanations, so I'll give you the really short version first, and then I'll get to the longer explanation. This is my favorite sword from the ones I own. What I'm not happy about is the differences in the promised measurements to the ones of my specific piece, especially the weight. I think that at this price point, you should really get better. You should be at least under 2% difference, and I'd really like to see it under 1% difference. So Albion should really do better here. Before I actually measured the sword, it felt really good in hand and still feels really good in hand. I just kinda like to have a centimeter more of blade length and 100 grams less of weight. Now, can I recommend this to people? No. I would not recommend people to buy this sword. And this is where it gets really difficult. Here's the difficult explanation why I can't recommend this to anyone. If you want a really good competition sword, just go and buy Alexandria or Principe. Those are better cutters than this, and they are not half the price but significantly cheaper. At least the Alexandria is something like $1,400 and this is almost $2,200. So for cutting, just go buy an Alexandria. If you want a training tool for cutting practice, whether it's just for cutting air or also cutting medium, such as tatami or water bottles, rather go and buy Albion Earl or Albion Cressy. Especially the Cressy costs something like $880, so you could get 2 of those and still have money left, or basically buy almost 3 of those for the price of one of these. This doesn't really make sense as a competition cutter or a training tool. In fact, you could go and buy the almost $1,400 Albion Alexandria and the almost $900 Cressy for almost the same price as this. So basically, the price of this plus a couple of $100 gets you 2 swords, one for training and one for competition. The training sword is better for training than this, and the competition sword is better for competition than this. On this base, buying this one makes absolutely no sense. This is over $2,000 sword, and it is not the best competition sword, and it is not even a really good training sword. The only reason you could have to buy this is if you really want this specific sword. You really like the original in the museum and you want a reproduction of that. That's your reason to get one of these. And that was my reason to get this sword. I have to say, I'm happy with this sword. It is a reproduction of the sword I wanted. It looks nice, it feels nice, it handles nice, but it has its issues, especially the weight. And if you want a more exact reproduction with the wolf inlay and such, your choices basically are get the Albion or buy a custom-made piece. If you buy the Albion, you know you are going to get a high-quality sword, and it's reasonably well within what they are actually saying on their website. Now, if you go for a custom sword, you actually may get a better match with the original. For the Albion, I know that Peter Johnson has handled the sword and taken measurements. With the custom sword makers, I have no idea. Also, Albion has a really good reputation with customer service and things like that. But for this price, which is a bit over of $2,000, you can basically get a sword from someone like Mateusz Zulowski or Damian Zulowski in Europe. I think they sell their swords somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 euros, but they include a scabbard and a belt system. You can get more for your money and possibly a more exact recreation of the sword you are actually looking for. I don't have any personal experience with any swords from those two. I'm just saying that I know that they at least can make something like this, and for this same-ish money you actually get more. So that is the long story of why I would not recommend anyone getting this. There is no logical reason for it. Again, I am very happy with the sword and I don't feel like I wasted my money. But again, only buy this if you really want this specific sword, and even then there might be better options for you. Consider those if you are looking for a La Lupa recreation, and then decide if you want to go for a custom sword, especially if you live in Europe because taxes, or if you want to purchase from Albion, because Albion really is a very established company in the sword market and you quite clearly know what you are going to get from them. Even though I was a bit surprised with the tolerances, especially with the weight. So, there you have it, my review of the Precious Spadona. If you're anything like me and you really enjoy sword reviews or cutting videos or stuff like that, do yourself a favor and subscribe to the channel. See you next time.